Okay. Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure today for the Barcelona Economic Society to host Professor James Stock. Um, he is a professor at the Department of Economics at Harvard and at the Kennedy School. He got his PhD from Berkeley, and his research areas focus on climate policy, macroeconomics, and energy economics. He is the vice provost for climate sustainability, and he's also the director of the Salata Institute for Climate Sustainability, both positions at Harvard. He has also served at the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and he has been chair of the economics department at Harvard and a co-editor of the prestigious journal Econometrica. So thank you. We are very happy to have him today to talk about one of his areas of expertise, climate change, and we're hoping he can illuminate us in a particular policy tool that is, I think, key in fighting climate change. So thanks again, Professor. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thanks so much, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk for maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we should switch to Q&A. And if there's something that, you rampantly disagree with or something that needs clarification, there must be some way for you to raise your hand or interrupt or send it in chat or something like that, and Carlos can help monitor that.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah, so what I'd like to talk about today is carbon pricing. So I suspect everybody on this call knows the rudiments of carbon pricing. So hopefully I'm going to go over some things that are not so rudimentary. So I'm going to start at the beginning, but then move forward. And I have a couple of, well, let me say before I do that, Carlos and I were having a conversation before this. About how climate change is simply not part of the current conversation because of the war, because of the Trump administration, because of pushback by certain groups in Europe and elsewhere. And that is, that has just been driven out of the conversation. I understand that, but it's not as though it's actually going to go away. I mean, the physics haven't changed. So as we continue to emit more CO2 and methane, these issues are just going to get worse. The issues associated with climate change and the damages are just going to get worse, and it's actually going to make it more challenging for us to reduce in the future. So, it's not in the news as much right now, but it's something that we simply can't let slip through our fingers. And there are, of course, important things that are being done. Europe, in particular, through the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is now being implemented in a more rigorous way. Um, there's other international agreements. So I think there's substantial stuff going on. It's just that it's not front and center in the headlines because of the current tumult. Okay, so but it is important. Okay, so uh, so I guess maybe let me take one more high level comment. If we think about carbon policies, and I'll be focusing on carbon pricing, but if we think about carbon policies, really we want to have four key features. One, we want it to be durable. So these changes in carbon policies are not helping anybody. They make it hard for industry. They make it hard for consumers. We need to have durable policy. Probably what that means is we need to have not especially ambitious policy, but I would argue that not especially ambitious policy that's durable is much more effective than on again, off again policy that is sometimes ambitious and sometimes moving backwards. Second thing we need to have is predictability. And in particular, I'll talk about carbon prices and predictability of prices and subsidies. Third, we need to have policies that are going to be supportive of economic growth. And fourth, we have to be cognizant and aware of the price implications for normal everyday consumers. So, if you increase the price of diesel by whatever, uh, a euro with a substantial carbon tax, that's really a burden on people. And so we need to be really cognizant of that. Okay. Okay, so let me just make a few. I'm just going to get started. So what I'm going to talk about today is carbon pricing. Um, I'll say a little bit about why, but I think that's going to be I think we all are on the same page. I hope we're all on the same page. I'll talk more generally about how carbon pricing fits into various policy tools. I'll talk about how carbon pricing has actually worked in theory and in practice. And and then I'm going to turn to the macroeconomic impacts of carbon pricing, and in particular, focus on the question of whether carbon pricing, how it affects growth. And so I'm going to talk about probably three different papers that are in the last couple of years that focus on carbon pricing, macroeconomic impacts. All right, so I'm going to make all of the analogies here because it's really rather straightforward to think about the externalities and the remedies in the context of smoking. So in the United States, at least, you don't see people smoking in restaurants anymore. But it's useful to think about what because, and the reason you don't is because secondhand smoke. So if that young lady is smoking there, that secondhand smoke is going to affect other people in the restaurant. And so that's an externality because they can get health effects from the secondhand smoke. So what are the implications of that, and what are the remedies? So there's a couple of different remedies. You can modify the property rights, so you can simply assert, as it's been done in the United States, there's no smoking in restaurants. So that's just changing property rights by a legal mechanism. You can do lots of price-based mechanisms. So you can have cigarette tax. In theory, you could have a quantity cap, like you could ration cigarettes. If we don't have trading of ration coupons, then that's not really a viable system. But if you have trading of ration coupons so that you can sell, I don't smoke, but if I get some coupons, I can sell it to somebody who smokes, then that's a way to impose a price on cigarettes. And then there's other things you can do. You can impose standards. So let's try to make cigarettes less harmful, so that when there's that secondhand smoke, it actually isn't going to be as harmful to the kids in the restaurant. And then you can also do subsidies. So an example of that in this context is that if you are not a smoker, maybe you can get cheaper health insurance. All of those different mechanisms. So I'm saying this here because it's all pretty straightforward in the context of smoking. All of those different mechanisms are available to us in terms of carbon policies. Okay, so there's plenty of externalities. I'm not going to belabor that. The monetary value of the externalities is something called the social cost of carbon, which is the net present value of damages done by emitting 1 ton of carbon today. And so that cost in a simple model would be the value of the externality. And if you want to internalize that externality so that the emitter, in this case, faces an actual price that reflects social damages, you would increase the price of the emissions by the social cost of carbon. So that would be a tax or cap and trade based mechanism. So, what can you do? You can modify the property rights. So it's the same thing as in the smoking. You can modify property rights. So you can regulate emissions, like the EU green natural gas standard is an example, or you can have technology mandates. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism is you can adjust prices. So you can have a carbon tax, just like the cigarette tax. You can set a quantity cap, so you can say the total amount of emissions that, let's say, the power sector can emit is fixed. And then you can do that. Well, if you do it without trading, again, that's kind of a mess because there's no way for the market to clear. But if you do it with trading of tradable permits, like in the EU ETS, emissions trading system, then that's a cap and trade system. Okay. So let me just give you a bit on the social cost of carbon. I'm not going to go into how it's calculated. I suspect some of you know a little bit about the social cost of carbon, and it's actually a really good study that was done by the Environmental Protection Agency in 2023 that updated the social cost of carbon. It has a very comprehensive set of references. It's a couple years out of date now, but it's a really a very strong study with references and explanations and calculations. So it's quite good. Anyway, when they do that, they got an estimate for emissions in 2020 and 2020 dollars of $190 per ton of external damages. If you turn that into damages in 2025 and 2025 dollars, that's about $225. So that's a lot. That's really a lot. So if you translate that per gallon of gasoline, and I'm sorry for using imperial units and U.S. dollars, but if you translate that for into into a gasoline tax, 200, let's say $225 a ton corresponds to around $2 a gallon. So that's just like a really, really big tax. And that's just reflecting what the damages are that are estimated. And it's hard to estimate those damages, but it's that's just it's just it's coming what comes out of the calculations. There are a bunch of countries that do carbon pricing. About what is it? About 20. I don't think I have that here. It's about 28% of emissions are covered by carbon pricing right now, of one form or another. Of that, 23% of emissions are covered by a cap and trade system like the EU ETS or some other standard, and about 5% are covered by a carbon tax. Now, most of the carbon taxes are actually in Europe. Okay, a little bit of basic theory, and this is the then and now part in the talk. So the then and now part is, and I think in some ways what I'm going to say kind of is like for you, it probably is going to seem really obvious, but it's an incredibly powerful observation that I think helps us really think about what the role of carbon pricing is. The then part, and this is probably, this is like what it was like 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, was we really didn't have cheap alternatives to fossil fuel generation. So if you're going to heat your house, it's like all you can do is like burn gas or oil or wood. And so there's really not any viable alternatives. You don't have EVs 10, 15 years ago to speak of. And in terms of generating of electricity, grid scale solar was really expensive. Even the wind was really expensive. So really the main way you can reduce emissions was simply through an overall demand mechanism. So you increase the price, and as a result, it's like you're shifting the supply curve up and you're just going to consume less. So that's the mechanism. You can do that in theory, you can do that under a carbon price, which is this figure on the left, carbon tax, or you can do it under a cap and trade system, which is this figure on the right. And in a static model, these two approaches are equivalent. You can replicate the allocations, prices, and quantities of a carbon tax with a cap and trade system where you set the quantity appropriately. So these are two different things. The reason I say this is the then part is that, of course, today there's many other alternatives to simply putting on a sweater. So I call this like the putting on a sweater version of reducing emissions. You just simply keep your house cooler, you drive less, that sort of thing. Today, it's really quite different because we have the opportunity to shift our production. It's not just reduce demand, but it's actually shift the way that we produce energy. And we can shift the way that we produce energy because now solar and wind are sufficiently inexpensive that they actually become viable alternatives. Solar plus battery still is, more expensive than natural gas in many parts of the world, but it becomes a viable alternative. So this series of pictures is just going to illustrate that. I'm going to illustrate it first. So this is what I've done here. We sort of think about the power sector and just imagine that there's only two ways to produce electricity. One is through a solar farm and the other is through coal. And I'm ignoring anything about dispatching and all of the real world complications. This is just illustrative. And then so we've got a supply curve for solar, we've got a supply curve for coal. The total supply curve just adds horizontally, and then we have demand. So demand equals supply for electricity, and then this is the amount of coal that we produce, and then this is the amount of solar that we produce. Okay, so then what happens with the carbon tax? What happens with the carbon tax is the solar doesn't have to pay the carbon tax, but coal has to pay the carbon tax. So the coal supply curve shifts up. It shifts up by the amount of the tax, and the overall supply curve, which is the horizontal sum, shifts up. So we actually have two phenomena going on. So phenomenon number one is that we're going to have a demand reduction effect because the price of electricity is higher. But phenomenon number two, which is arguably much more important, is that we're going to have a shift in the production of electricity, and it's going to use a lot less coal, and it's going to use more solar. So that shift mechanism is now available, and it wasn't available 10 years ago. And arguably, that's really the most important mechanism. What we need to do is we need to stop using coal and start using solar and wind and batteries, or nuclear or other low carbon technologies. And it's really about changing the composition of production, more than just like making everybody wear a sweater. I think that's like my main now and then point. And I know it might seem obvious, but it's really important as we go back and think about, say, the level of prices in the EU ETS, or how would we design carbon policies in a way that doesn't really impact consumers, but nonetheless makes the energy transition work. If we realize that the shifting feature is a much more powerful mechanism than simply wearing a sweater. Okay. You can do the same sort of picture for a subsidy. So here, what I've done is I subsidize solar, and that's shifting the solar supply curve down. The supply curve now is the sum of solar and coal. Prices actually go down a little bit, so you're actually consuming more electricity. You're taking off your sweater, but what you're doing is you're actually producing much more of that electricity by solar. So and you're actually producing less in coal because the price has gone down. So some of those coal units aren't going to be competitive anymore. So you get the same sort of effect of substitution, but you get an effect that doesn't really, that's not hard on consumers.
So
Okay,
sorry, Professor.
please.
Just I found it very interesting that you compared a tax and a subsidy. What do you
Mhm.
think is best?
Um, I'm going to actually argue that neither of them is best. Okay. Um,
Okay.
and the problem with a subsidy is that that's a burden on taxpayers, so current and future generations. So we're increasing the deficit. The problem with a tax is that it's like, punitive for consumers, where they're not going to have much margin. You're not going to get much of the emissions reduction coming from the demand effect. You're really trying to get the emissions reduction coming from a substitution effect. So the mechanism that I think balances these two is one that really increases consumption, increases prices by a pretty modest amount, but at the same time is internally self-financed, so that you don't need to, you're not paying the government for the tax, or you're not buying tradable permits like ETS permits from the government. So that's what is often called a tradable allowance system, or a tradable, so here, or a sort of a clean electricity standard. So these are standards that say a certain fraction of your electricity needs to be clean. So I'm going to use that illustration here because in the example, we have a coal plant and a solar farm. So that's the only two choices. We don't have anything in between in this example. So in this example, you want to reduce emissions, and that means using more solar. So one thing you can do is you can just have a regulation that says we have a path where that path is going to be reducing emissions, and it's going to happen by a regulatory standard that is increasing the amount of clean electricity that's required to be on the grid. Okay, so how does that work? Um, So suppose that here this is worked out for an example where there's a mandate that 80% of the electricity has to be clean. In my example, I've only got solar and I only have wind, so that means 80% is going to have to be solar. So how does that work? It's actually, if you think about it, it's actually kind of tricky to think about how this would work in a decentralized fashion. Because yeah, you can tell like producers to produce 80% clean, but if I only own a coal plant, how do I do that? I don't even know how to do that. And if I only own a solar plant, how do I do that? And you could say, well, the solar plant guy should buy some coal or well, vice versa. But then if you think about the mechanics of that, it's pretty difficult to see how you would get that to balance. And so the really clever thing about these tradable performance standards or clean electricity standards is that you can use market forces to determine what those price incentives need to be to get the emissions to get 20% clean. So I'm going to work through an example where you have an 80% clean mandate. And I'm going to imagine that there is 4 megawatts that are demanded. Okay, so um, so let's 5 megawatts that are demanded. Okay, so the coal plant is if we want the coal plant to generate 1 megawatt hour, and we want the solar farm to produce 4 megawatt hours, so that's 80% clean. How do we actually get that to happen? And the way we do that is through a tradable permit system. And so the solar plant, because it's completely clean, generate, it's going to generate clean electricity credits. And so because one clean electricity is credit is generated for each megawatt hour. So what does it do? It has to so under this regulation of the clean electricity credit, it has to hand in 80% of its generation as clean electricity credits and send that to the regulatory authority. Here I'm showing the EPA building headquarters. So that means that the solar plant generates 4 megawatt hours, it generates 4 clean electricity credits, it hands in 80% of those, or 3.2, to the EPA. It has 0.8 left over. This coal plant, it needs to hand in 80% worth of its 1 megawatt hour in terms of clean electricity credits to the EPA. It doesn't generate those. It doesn't know, it can't produce those by itself, but it can buy those clean electricity credits from the solar farm. And then once it does, it hands them in. And the beauty of that is that the price of this clean electricity credit is what gets the market to clear. So that price is going to adjust so that the subsidy you need, either the tax you need on it's a combination of taxes and subsidies. So it's like a tax on the coal plant and a subsidy for the solar plant. And as you think about marching out the supply curve, it's for the two, it's going to provide just by the market forces is going to provide exactly what you need so that the coal plant can hand in 0.8 clean electricity credits and the solar plant can hand in 3.2 clean electricity credits, and it's the price that adjusts to make that happen. Now, the thing about that is that this is totally internally self-financing. So there's no government doesn't take any money out of the system. It's getting these clean electricity credits, but those turned in, but there's no flow of cash. Nobody's paying a carbon tax for this. And similarly, the government isn't giving a subsidy to the solar plant. So the taxing mechanism comes through the sale of the clean electricity credit, but that's a transfer to the solar farm. So it's a subsidy to the solar farm and a tax on the coal, and it's completely internally self-contained. And what that means is that you're not burdening future taxpayers, but at the same time, you're not generating a lot of revenue, which would increase the price of electricity. So it's an elegant system that can work. I'm going to show you a picture. So one comment in practice, this is the EU ETS trading price, and there's a lot of flexibility or a lot of variability in EU ETS prices, a lot of turbulence in EU ETS prices. And I think that going back to my comment on predictability and being able to make investments, it's pretty tough to be able to make investments when you have this amount of price volatility in in, um, in the system. So I think that's actually a challenge for a cap and trade system as opposed to a tax. Okay, this is a cool picture, or I think this is a cool picture. So, um, what I'm going to show you is on a single picture, I'm going to show you the price wedges that are associated with a number of different federal climate policies. So the simplest one is a production tax credit just for clean electricity. So here's solar, all right? So here's some solar and you give it a production tax credit for that amount. So you only get it for something that's completely clean. And then you don't get it, so that then you don't get it for anything else. Here's what a carbon tax would look like. So a carbon tax would look, it's a price schedule that is going to be linear in the amount of carbon emissions because it's a tax on your carbon emissions. So it's just linear in the price, linear in the emissions. If you are a solar plant, you don't pay anything. If you're a particular, there's different ranges of coal plants, but if you're a pretty dirty coal plant, then you're going to pay pretty much. And if you are like a gas plant, then you're going to pay somewhere in the middle. So that's a linear system. There's other variations on it. So here's a clean energy standard. The way the clean energy standards in the US have been proposed is that they actually say you don't have to be completely clean, like you could be natural gas with carbon capture and storage, so that you would be like 20% emissions reductions or something along those lines. This is a clean energy standard where it doesn't have to be completely clean. You might include some pretty clean things like carbon capture and storage. This is a hybrid clean energy standard, so you might have a certain requirement for a certain amount of clean of the clean category, but then you might have a requirement for an intermediate amount of the natural gas, and then a lower requirement for coal. And so this would be a subsidy through a clean hybrid clean electricity standard. And then this is the most elegant of all, which is a tradable performance standard. So a tradable performance standard says that if you remember the example I gave back here, um, this was a clean electricity standard, but it also could be thought of as a tradable performance standard. It's just that I only allowed two different technologies, which is solar and coal. If you have a suite of technologies, natural gas, some coal plants are dirty, some coal plants are clean. Really what you'd want to do is you'd want these credits to be, based on the amount of emissions that you actually do. So if you're a coal plant, you're going to have to hand in a lot of these credits. If you're a natural gas plant, you're going to have to hand in less of these credits. If you're natural gas with carbon capture and storage, you have to hand in even less of them. And if you're a solar plant, or you're going to be able to, I should say, you're going to be able to generate some. And if you're a solar plant, you're going to be able to generate all of these. So that's sort of a clean electricity. That's a tradable performance standard, and you can see in a tradable performance standard, some people are getting a subsidy, some people are getting a tax, and it kind of averages out. So, there's probably, some effect on prices, but it's not going to be a big effect on prices. So that's tradable performance standards. All
Right.
right. So
Sorry,
let's see.
we have
Yeah.
a question in
Yeah.
the chat. Can you see it? If you want, I can read it out loud for you.
You there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh no. Having the dread Zoom freeze.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Um, I said there's a question in the chat.
Mhm.
Um, do you want me to read it aloud or?
Yeah. Yeah, please. I don't seem to
Yeah.
have I
So
don't see the chat
Anissa
right now.
is asking. So she first she put out an opinion. She said regarding tax and subsidies, it only move the burden from the site A to B, but in her opinion, the total is still the same. She said we ask tax and give them and drag as a subsidies to others. We didn't consider the economy capacity of taxpayer. it's a different system if we ask the rich and distribute their asset for the poor for equality as a sustainability. So she said the question is how, if we cannot control the consumption, is it still relevant to have a carbon pricing? Because still there is a lag or time that we need to convert or move the carbon pricing or profit that we get to solve the other problem. I,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just
So,
reading just the literal message.
and for some reason,
I if Anissa, you want to clarify, please speak out. I don't know if you can, but feel free to clarify anything if I have not
yeah,
read it
yeah.
properly.
Feel free to jump in if there's a way to do that.
Right. So, what do you think?
Okay. So, there are a number of questions in there. Uh, I guess, doing something progressively through the tax system has other advantages. If you want to have a more progressive tax system, carbon taxes, a straight carbon tax, without any redistribution of the income, is actually regressive because people with lower incomes have a higher share of their spending on energy goods because of the inelastic nature of energy goods. So um, that's also another problem with the carbon tax. If it's just a straight transfer of revenue to the government, you can have something that looks like this. Well, not exactly like this, but if you take the carbon tax and you take those revenues and you do a lump sum redistribution, then one way to think about that is you're shifting this black line up to the gold line. And that makes it, if you do a lump sum redistribution, then that makes it more progressive for sure. And the theory of that is it makes it a lot more politically saleable. I think that theory on the political science side is not has not really been borne out. People just don't trust the government to really do that redistribution. And so, yeah, somebody says they're going to redistribute, you're going to get a check or something like that. But I don't know. Or you're going to reduce your taxes. I don't know. Like, is that really going to happen? So it seems like an elegant theory that has problems in the real world, I guess, is in terms of the redistribution of carbon tax. Whereas if you do something like a tradable performance standard, it's essentially invisible to taxpayers and consumers because it's all happening inside and you never have to pay the higher electricity price. So I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if that answers the question. Okay. Um,
Thank you.
Let me say, I want to say just a couple of words here on this is a little this is definitely out of date. A lot has happened in the United States on energy policy since 2024. But the purpose of this is, I think it's actually really hard to do these calculations and stay up to date. But the purpose of this is to show you the power of the substitution effect. Uh, so, so this is what the path of emissions were under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. If you then it simulates what happens if you repeal the IRA. But I think the one I want to stress is that if you take the IRA back then when it was law and you do something incredibly small, you put on a 15, excuse me, $15 carbon tax. That is an order of magnitude less than the social cost of carbon. It's a tiny, tiny tax. It's 12 cents a gallon on gasoline. It's really small, but it is enough to make coal plants, which are incredibly emitting, just become uneconomical. So the coal plants, so you see in the United States, you see big retirements in coal plants from a $15 carbon tax. And you would see big retirements in coal plants from a tradable performance standard if the price of the tradable performance standard was $15. Equivalent of $15 per ton of CO2. So very, very low prices can have really big effects in terms of making renewables much more cost effective. All right, so this is a summary. I think part of this is analytical, part of it is just opinions. I don't know. So I have all these slides on the macroeconomics of carbon pricing. It's pretty interesting, but on the other hand, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So, uh, I mean, maybe I could pause there, and if there's interest, I can do some of the macroeconomics of carbon pricing. How does that sound?
I think that sounds fine. We will open the round of questions, and depending on how many there are, I think we'll have time to do both.
Yeah, okay.
So, um, anyone, please just you can unmute yourselves and ask the question.
Okay. Well, if there's no questions, why don't I do a little bit on the macro of carbon pricing?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So. Um, You, it's about one of the. I kind of had it prepared. But you kind of hinted at it at the beginning of your talk. You said we needed to think about economic growth.
Yeah.
So right now there's a lot of talk about degrowth or like the circular economy. What do you think about these kind of theories?
You know, I don't have a slide on degrowth. Um, So circular economy, to the extent that it's cost effective, is a great idea. So we have to be, there's going to need to be some policy incentives to do that because in some cases, it's cost effective. Like we do a lot of recycling of aluminum cans already. But to make a full circular economy, like for EV batteries or sort of across the board, most of that requires some subsidies. I don't know. I mean, the technology is going to be really different from case to case. So how much those subsidies need to be, but for sure, that's a worthwhile thing to think about. I think degrowth is, here I'm coming at this from an American perspective. I think that that's quite problematic. Uh, People. I think it's a it's what it's a it's a very what's the right way to say this? Uh, it's certainly not here's one way to say this. Most of emissions that we expect to happen in the future are going to be from developing economies, especially from India and China. So as EU and US decarbonize, and they will, we're going to see these emissions from other parts of the country and to think of other parts of the globe. And to think about a strategy or a recommendation for them, like don't grow, don't improve the quality of life. It's just that just isn't, that's just not morally satisfactory. So, uh, I think that sure, for some people who want to have smaller houses living in the woods in Sweden, that sounds fun. I'd like to do that. Actually, it sounds great. Uh, but that's not a big solution.
Right. Perfect. So we have another question in the chat. So
Yeah.
Kelton Santos said, you refer to the volatility of carbon prices and its implications for investment decisions. What are your views on the best methods to use to predict forecast carbon prices?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard to forecast carbon prices. So if you look at, um, let's see, let me just share this again. If you, so I think I'm there. If you just look at this price for the EU ETS, I mean, frankly, that basically, I don't know. What does that look like? I guess to my eye, it looks like this could just be a random walk with drift or something that has a lot of unpredictability. You could say there's some mean reversion here. And that mean reversion, if there is mean reversion, it's probably because of endogeneity in terms of how the standards are actually set and reflecting things like Ukraine and especially affecting the high gas prices in Europe and high oil prices, but high gas prices in particular that we're seeing in the current situation with the Strait of Hormuz being closed. So, maybe there's mean reversion here, but the range is just enormous. The range, in a few years is from over $100 to, low 50s or something in terms of the prices. And so if you're trying to say, I'm going to get a subsidy of thus and such for my solar plant, I don't know, like how much is a subsidy? Is it going to be $100? Is it going to be $70? Is it going to be $40, $50? That makes it really hard. That makes it really hard. It makes it really hard to bring that to a to bring that to a financing decision. It makes it really hard to bring to investors. So I think that's actually one problem with cap and trade systems. The volatility in tradable performance standards is a little bit less, and the reason for that is if they're fractional standards, then there's volatility here because of fluctuations in demand. So when demand is really high, then you're going to drive up for electricity. Then you're with an actual cap, you're just going to drive up prices. And when demand happens to be low, like you suppose you're in a low growth situation, then prices are going to go down. And that's the problem that makes it difficult for firms to plan their investments. That channel of volatility isn't present in a tradable performance standard because those tradable performance standards are per megawatt hour, not a total cap. And if it's a per megawatt hour standard, then if the demand for megawatt hours is more because we're in a boom, then that sort of takes care of itself because it's a per megawatt hour uh, basis. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think so. So if there are no further questions, I think we have some time to look at those macroeconomic slides.
Yeah,
Uh,
good, good. So, yeah, so there are three papers that I would flag um, that are pretty that one of them is a paper by myself with Gib Metcalf where we look at the macro impacts, the impacts on GDP and on employment and on inflation of carbon taxes in the EU, which about half of at least in our data set, about half of the countries, an extended EU sample, about half the countries have carbon taxes. A second paper is one by Diego Kanzig, and he looks at the effect of EU ETS price changes on macroeconomic activities. And then a third paper it looks at the effect of carbon price uncertainty, carbon policy uncertainty on economic performance. And that's a paper by Diego Kanzig and myself and Kostas Kavlidis. Okay, um, so I'm just going to show you a couple of quick things. So the carbon price paper, I think we can look at it. We use a method called local projections, which either you know or you don't. Um, and but here's just a diff and diff case study example. So this is on. We look at changes in carbon prices, but this is just when a carbon price is imposed. So this is an easy thing to plot. So when the carbon price is imposed for a number of different countries, so here are the countries down here, uh, Switzerland, Denmark, that sort of thing. And what you see here is GDP growth as an annual percent before and after the imposition of the carbon tax. So the carbon tax occurs right here, and there's a lot of volatility because these countries have different growth rates. But the thing that's remarkable is that at least on average, the growth rate there's basically no change in the growth rate after you impose the carbon tax. So there seems to be no effect on GDP of imposing a carbon tax in these countries. If you look at it on employment, there actually seems to be a small boost in employment, which is a little weird, but that might just be, I think if you look at these standard errors, I wouldn't take that very seriously because it's the point estimate is positive, but the standard errors go, pretty fairly wide. So I wouldn't take that too seriously. But what there is for sure is that there's a reduction in emissions. Now, these are not very big carbon taxes. Most of them are like $40. So you don't see a big reduction in emissions, but that reduction is really consistent. These are old, these are like data from the teens and the 2000s. And that's consistent with the demand response in the covered sectors. The main covered sector for these carbon taxes is in liquid fuels, transportation, and home heating, oil and natural gas. So basically, you see that there is effect on emissions. There's, for all practical purposes, no effect on either employment or GDP. We do some impulse response functions, and here's the summary picture when you actually do the regression analysis of what's the effect of a change in the carbon price, not just imposition, but a change in the carbon tax. And you see basically no effect whatsoever on GDP growth, and no effect to speak of on employment. And there is this negative effect on emissions. So emissions go down. So I think the conclusion here, these are pretty small carbon taxes, so you wouldn't necessarily expect to see any really huge effect, but you see basically, I mean, this is quite remarkable. It's basically a reasonably precisely estimated zero for its effect on GDP. And I think what's interesting about that is if you compare it to the EU ETS, which is now, this is the Konzig paper a couple of years ago. And these are Diego's slides. If you compare it to the EU ETS, you see quite different impulse response functions. So you see that the EU ETS reduces industrial production, increases unemployment, increases energy prices, and decreases emissions. Now, this decrease in emissions is partly a substitution effect, but actually these EU ETF surprise positive prices are recessionary, and that means with lower production, you're actually going to be emitting less. So he gets quite different results for the EU ETS, and I think that the interesting question is, why do you get different results for EU ETS prices and for carbon prices? And there's a number of different hypotheses for why that might be the case. So this is an example. So this is our effect on GDP, and this is Diego's effect on industrial production. So you see quite different results, and the question is, like, why is that? And that's why I list a bunch of different reasons here. One is that either they made a mistake or we made a mistake, but I don't think they did, and I don't think we did. So I don't think that's it. There's other little things. They do monthly data and we do annual country level data. So there's a little difference there, but I don't think that's it. There's some questions about identification, but I think we both were pretty careful on the identification front. So I don't think that's it. The one thing that's different is that monetary policy seems to respond differently to a country level carbon tax than it does to the EU ETS. And maybe the logic for that is that the EU ETS price affects all of the countries in the EU. And so the ECB might be doing some response to an inflationary boost as a result of an increase in the EU ETS price. So the EU ETS price is going to increase energy prices, of course, because it passes it through to energy prices. And it then looks like what the ECB is doing is it seems to be jacking up the 2-year rate in response to that inflationary boost. And jacking up that 2-year rate then results in this decline in industrial production. You can see the timing here of the 2-year rate going up, and then a few months later, industrial production going down kind of makes sense. So I think that you know, and that mechanism is not present in the carbon tax. And the reason I think for that is that the carbon tax changes, those price changes, are all price changes at the country level. And the EU, the ECB is not really reacting to, I don't know, a change in the carbon price in one country as much as it is to overall price across the EU. So across the Eurozone. So I don't know. I think I think that's a plausible reason. I don't think that it's because of different sectoral coverages. Uh, it's There's a possibility that revenue recycling in the carbon tax makes a difference, but we looked at that. That is using revenue to reduce carbon tax revenue to reduce taxes and therefore boost growth. But we didn't seem to find that in the paper. And the other possibility is that it just simply is a fundamental feature of cap and trade, which is that cap and trade has worse macroeconomic consequences than a carbon tax. And that I would say is, if there is a reason for that, it would be because of the price volatility, where you just don't have that price volatility with the carbon tax. So that price volatility retards investment, and the retarding of investment slows economic activity, and it slows the energy transition. So I think there's something to that, actually. But anyway, that's I anyway, these are I like Diego's paper. It's really interesting stuff. So I'm just going to leave it. I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Just if anyone else has any questions, please speak up. I will use this opportunity though to talk about your book, your textbook actually, Introduction to Econometrics. I forgot to do that in the beginning, but I definitely used it a lot for some of my econometrics courses. So if you know, if some of the undergrads know the name, it's from this book. Um, in case you haven't taken econometrics yet, when you do, it's really worth taking a look at it. So thank you, Professor Stock. It
I
was
didn't
a
pay.
pleasure hosting you. Um,
I didn't pay you for that advertising.
oh, that's you don't need to. The value of the book was more than enough. So thank you. Thank you everyone for coming and participating. And that's it. So
Okay.
goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.